You're accusing me in my own house?
I'm not accusing you, Marcus.
Then what are you doing?
Telling them what you stole from my father.
Naomi, don't.
You should have thought about that 26 years ago.
Marcus Whitfield lifted his glass one more time that night, and the entire ballroom rose with him. 40 years of money and manners standing in unison, because that is what people do when a billionaire asks them to. Crystal chandeliers threw gold light across $500,000 worth of flowers, and somewhere near the kitchen doors, a woman named Naomi Bishop refilled a water pitcher for a table she had not been assigned to serve. She had worked in that house for 11 years. She had ironed his shirts, raised her voice to no one, and learned exactly how much space a person is allowed to take up in a room that does not belong to her. Nobody in that ballroom knew her name. By the end of the night, every one of them would never forget it. It started as a joke, the kind rich men tell when they've had 4 glasses of champagne and forgotten that the people around them are still people. Marcus turned from his toast, spotted Naomi near the dessert table, and asked her, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, whether the entertainment was allowed to eat the cake before the guests did. A ripple of laughter went through the closest tables. Naomi did not laugh. She set the pitcher down carefully, the way she always did, and said nothing, because saying nothing had kept her employed for 11 years. But Marcus was not finished. He had an audience now, and audiences were the only thing that had ever truly satisfied him. He stepped closer, swaying slightly, and told the room that he'd heard money had gone missing from his study the week before, and wondered aloud, theatrically, whether the help had been helping themselves. 50 conversations stopped at once. Glasses lowered. Somewhere behind Marcus, his wife's face went the color of the tablecloth. Naomi felt every eye in that ballroom land on her at the same moment. The particular weight of being accused in public by a man who had never once learned how to spell her name correctly on a paycheck. She had 2 choices in that instant, the same 2 choices she had lived inside for 11 years. Stay silent, or speak. For 11 years, silence had been the safer choice. It had paid her rent, put her daughter through nursing school, kept a roof over 2 heads in a city that did not forgive people like her for making noise. But something had shifted in Naomi over the past 6 months, something none of the 50 people in that ballroom knew anything about, something that had nothing to do with missing money and everything to do with a truth she had been carrying quietly since long before she ever wore this uniform. Marcus Whitfield had just handed her a stage in front of everyone who mattered to him. He had no idea what she would choose to do with it. Naomi lifted her chin. The room, still holding its breath, watched a woman who had spent a decade being invisible finally decide she was done being small. Her lips parted. 5 words were about to leave her mouth. 5 words that would not just end Marcus Whitfield's night, but unravel a truth he had spent his entire adult life burying under marble floors and charitable donations. The ballroom leaned in without realizing it was leaning. Somewhere, a server froze mid-step with a tray in his hands. Simone Whitfield's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. And just as Naomi's voice was about to break the silence she had kept for 11 long years, everything went black. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Naomi was about to say in that ballroom did not come from anger, and it did not come from 11 years of quiet resentment finally boiling over. It came from something far older, something that started long before she ever set foot in the Whitfield mansion, back when she was a younger woman with a different last name and a life nobody at that gala could have imagined for her. To understand the 5 words that were about to silence a room full of the wealthiest people in the city, we have to go back. Back to where Naomi's story truly began, long before Marcus Whitfield ever learned her name. 6 months before that ballroom fell silent, Naomi Bishop woke at 4:45 in the morning in a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, the same way she had woken every day for the past 11 years. She made coffee she rarely had time to finish, laid out her uniform on the back of a kitchen chair, and checked on her daughter Denise, asleep in the next room after another double shift at the hospital. Naomi was 52 years old, and she had learned that mornings were the only part of the day that truly belonged to her. Before the buses, before the Whitfield estate, before she became, once again, a woman other people looked past without seeing. She took 2 buses to get to the Whitfield property, a house so large it had its own zip code for deliveries, sitting on 11 acres that used to be farmland before Marcus's father bought it for almost nothing decades earlier. Naomi had worked there since she was 41, back when Marcus's parents still ran the household and treated the staff with something resembling basic decency. Things changed slowly after his father passed, and Marcus took control of the family's holdings. The house stayed beautiful. The man running it did not stay kind. Naomi noticed these things the way people who clean up after others always notice things, quietly, without ever being asked for her opinion. Her daughter Denise had grown up mostly without a father, since Naomi's husband James died in a workplace accident when Denise was 9 years old, a settlement that never came close to covering what the family actually lost. Naomi raised Denise alone after that, cleaning 3 houses a week until the Whitfield position became full-time and steady enough to build something on. She never remarried, never really tried to. She used to say she'd already found the love of her life once, and she wasn't interested in settling for less the second time around. Denise became a nurse instead of a lawyer, the career Naomi had once pushed for, and Naomi had long since stopped fighting her daughter's choices. What almost nobody at that gala knew, what almost nobody in Naomi's daily life knew either, was that she had once lived a very different existence, decades earlier, in a small town 400 miles from the city where she now spent her days scrubbing floors that weren't hers. She had grown up the daughter of a man named Elijah Bishop, a quiet, hard-working man who spent 30 years building a small construction company from nothing, one contract at a time, until it became the largest black-owned construction firm in that part of the state. Naomi had grown up believing her family's name meant something. She had grown up believing hard work eventually got rewarded. Both of those beliefs would be tested long before she ever heard the name Marcus Whitfield. Elijah Bishop's company built houses, schools, and eventually entire subdivisions. And by the time Naomi turned 20, her father had partnered with a young, ambitious real estate developer looking to expand into residential construction on a much larger scale. That developer had charm, connections, and a hunger that Elijah mistook for shared ambition rather than what it actually was. Naomi remembered him from a handful of dinners at her parents' house. A polite young man in an expensive suit who complimented her mother's cooking and shook her father's hand like they were building something together that would outlast them both. His name, back then, was simply Marcus. Nobody in that dining room could have predicted what he would become, or what he would eventually take. The partnership between Elijah Bishop and the young developer lasted 3 years, and for the first 2 of those years, it appeared to be everything Elijah had hoped for. Contracts multiplied. The company's name appeared on new developments across the county. Marcus brought capital and connections to banks that had never once returned Elijah's calls when he tried financing expansion on his own years earlier. Naomi remembered her father coming home those years lighter than she had ever seen him, talking about legacy, about finally building something his grandchildren could inherit outright. She remembered her mother setting an extra place at the table whenever Marcus came by to review numbers, treating him like family, because Elijah trusted him like family. Trust, Naomi would later understand, was the only thing Marcus had ever needed from her father. Everything else, he intended to take for himself. The trouble began quietly, the way trouble involving contracts and paperwork usually does. Marcus proposed restructuring the partnership agreement to protect the company from what he called market volatility, paperwork so dense with legal language that even Elijah's own lawyer, an overworked man juggling too many clients, missed the clause buried on page 11 that shifted majority ownership triggers in the event of specific financial thresholds. Elijah signed it on a Tuesday afternoon in his own kitchen, trusting a man he had fed dinner to 100 times. Naomi was 22 then, home for the weekend from junior college, and she remembered Marcus lingering just a little too long at the door that evening, thanking her father for his trust in a tone that sounded, even to her at the time, faintly rehearsed. 18 months later, a downturn hit the regional construction market, the kind of downturn that happens every decade or so and usually corrects itself within a year. Marcus used that window to invoke the clause nobody had noticed, citing missed financial thresholds that his own restructured accounting had quietly engineered. Elijah found himself outvoted on his own company's board by investors Marcus had brought in without full disclosure. Men Naomi's father had never met until the meeting where they voted to remove him from daily operations. The lawsuit Elijah filed the following spring went nowhere, not because his claims lacked merit, but because Marcus had spent 18 months quietly building a legal fortress, while Elijah had spent that same time simply trying to keep his workers paid. Marcus's attorneys buried the case in procedural delays for 2 years, and by the time a judge finally reviewed the underlying contract, the statute of limitations on several key claims had already closed. Elijah's own lawyer, the same overworked man who missed the clause on page 11, quietly stopped returning calls somewhere around month 14. Naomi remembered sitting beside her father in a courthouse hallway that smelled like old coffee and floor wax, watching him read a dismissal notice twice, as though reading it a second time might change the words on the page. It did not. Marcus, meanwhile, was already breaking ground on his first subdivision under the Whitfield name, using equipment and crews that had once belonged to her father's company. Elijah never fully recovered from what happened, not financially and not in the quieter ways that mattered more to the people who loved him. He took smaller jobs after that, subcontracting for companies that once used to bid against him, swallowing a kind of humiliation that never announced itself loudly, but never fully left the room either. He stopped talking about legacy. He stopped setting extra places at the table. Naomi watched her mother take on a second job to help cover the gap, watched her father's hands, once steady enough to frame an entire house without a level, start to shake slightly when he thought no one was looking. He died 11 years later of a heart condition doctors said had likely been building for a decade, though Naomi always believed the real damage had been done in that courthouse hallway long before any doctor found it on a chart. By the time Elijah passed, Naomi was 34, recently widowed herself, raising a young daughter on an income that never quite stretched far enough. She had watched Marcus's name grow larger across the region for over a decade by then, watched his company signs appear on skylines and shopping centers, watched him become the kind of man magazines wrote profiles about, always framed as self-made, always photographed in front of buildings he had not built from nothing at all. She never once considered approaching him, never once considered telling anyone the version of events that lived only in her memory and in a box of her father's old paperwork stored beneath her bed. What would have been the point? Men like Marcus Whitfield did not answer to women like her, not in courtrooms, not in newspapers, and certainly not at dinner tables anymore. 11 years ago, an agency placed Naomi in a housekeeping position at a large estate outside the city, the kind of job she took because it paid steadily and asked no questions about her past. She did not learn the homeowner's full name until her second week. When she saw it printed on an insurance document left open on a desk she was dusting. Marcus Whitfield, the same face, older now, heavier around the jaw, standing in a framed photograph on the mantel of a house built partly on the bones of everything her father had lost. Naomi stood in that hallway for a long moment, her cloth still in her hand, deciding in complete silence what she was going to do with what she now knew. She decided that day to wait. Naomi told herself, that first week, that waiting was simply the practical choice, the same way silence had always been the practical choice in her life. She needed the job. Denise was still in high school then, with college still years away and no clear way to pay for it. and a housekeeping position at a house that size paid nearly twice what she'd earned cleaning 3 smaller homes a week. So she folded the knowledge of who Marcus Whitfield really was into the same quiet place where she kept everything else too heavy to carry openly. And she went back to dusting the mantle, and she did not let her hands shake the way her father's once had. What she did not expect, in those early months, was how quickly the job would teach her exactly the kind of man she was now working for, and how little that man had changed since the evenings he once sat at her parents' table. Marcus, by then in his mid-40s, had built a reputation in certain circles as generous, visionary, a man who gave keynote speeches about pulling himself up through grit and instinct. Naomi heard him rehearse those speeches sometimes, alone in his study, practicing lines about growing up with nothing and building an empire through sheer will, and she would stand just outside the door with a stack of folded towels, listening to a man erase her father from his own origin story in real time. He never once mentioned Elijah Bishop. Not to reporters, not to business partners, not even, as far as Naomi could tell, to himself in the privacy of his own home. He had built an entire identity on top of a foundation someone else poured, and he seemed, genuinely, to believe every word of it. Simone Whitfield, Marcus's wife, was a different kind of presence in that house entirely. She had married Marcus 14 years earlier, back when his fortune was already established, but his cruelty had not yet fully calcified into habit. Naomi liked her, in the careful, professional way staff are permitted to like the people they work for. Simone remembered birthdays. She asked about Denise by name. She once sat with Naomi in the kitchen for 20 minutes during a thunderstorm that knocked out the power, talking about nothing important, treating her, for those 20 minutes, like an actual person rather than a fixture of the house. But Naomi also watched Simone grow smaller over the years. Watched the confident woman from the early photographs on the staircase fade into someone who chose her words more carefully with each passing anniversary. Someone who had learned, much like Naomi had learned long ago, exactly which battles were worth losing quietly. The household ran on a particular rhythm that Naomi came to understand within her first year, one built around managing Marcus's moods rather than his schedule. Isabel Reyes, his executive assistant, functioned less like an employee and more like a translator, softening his demands before they reached other staff, absorbing his temper so it landed on her rather than anyone else. Isabel had worked for Marcus for 6 years by the time Naomi's own tenure reached its midpoint, and the two women developed a quiet understanding neither of them ever spoke aloud directly. An unspoken agreement that survival in that house meant noticing everything and reacting to almost nothing. It was Isabel who first mentioned, in passing, that something had been troubling Marcus in recent months, something involving numbers that did not add up the way they should have across 2 of his oldest development projects. That conversation happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, nearly 6 months before the gala, while Naomi was polishing silver in the pantry, and Isabel came in looking for a set of car keys that had gone missing from the front hall table. Isabel mentioned, almost as an aside, that Marcus had spent the entire morning on the phone with his accountant, his voice carrying through 2 closed doors, something about discrepancies in the books for the Riverside Commons development, a project completed nearly 15 years earlier under circumstances Naomi remembered better than anyone in that house could possibly have known. Isabel didn't think much of it at the time. Executives had bad mornings. Numbers occasionally didn't reconcile. But Naomi felt something tighten in her chest at the mention of that specific project, because Riverside Commons had not started as Marcus's development at all. It had started as her father's. Over the following weeks, Naomi began noticing small changes in the household that told her more than any overheard phone call could. Marcus started locking his study door during the day, something he had never bothered doing before. He met privately with his accountant twice as often, men in gray suits arriving early and leaving looking drained. He grew short-tempered with Simone over things that had nothing to do with money, snapping at her for rearranging flowers or scheduling dinner too late. The way people snap at those closest to them when the real source of their fear feels too large to name out loud. Naomi recognized the pattern immediately. She had watched her own father unravel in smaller, quieter ways once, decades earlier, when the walls of something he'd built started closing in around him. Watching Marcus experience even a shadow of that unraveling stirred something in her she hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly. Something closer to recognition. The discrepancy, as Naomi eventually pieced together from fragments of conversation she was never meant to hear, involved an old audit trail connected to how ownership of Riverside Commons had originally transferred out of Bishop Construction and into Marcus's holdings all those years ago. A junior analyst at Marcus's accounting firm, reviewing records ahead of a routine refinancing, had flagged inconsistencies in the original transfer documentation, the same documentation Naomi's father had once signed in his own kitchen, trusting a young man who called him a partner. Marcus wasn't worried about losing the property itself. Riverside Commons had long since been folded into a larger portfolio worth exponentially more. He was worried about what a deeper audit might reveal about how he had acquired it, and about who might still be alive to remember the truth of what happened. Naomi did not go looking for any of this information. It arrived in pieces, the way most important truths arrive in a house full of people who assume the help cannot understand what they're overhearing. She never once considered using what she learned as leverage, not seriously, not in those early weeks. What she felt instead, standing in that pantry with a silver spoon still in her hand, was something quieter and far more dangerous to a man like Marcus than blackmail ever could have been. She felt patient. She had waited 11 years already. She could wait a little longer, if waiting meant the truth would finally surface on its own, in its own time, without her having to say a single word to force it into the light. Isabel noticed the shift in Naomi before Naomi herself fully registered that anything had changed. It was small things at first, the kind of details only someone trained to read a room for a living would catch. Naomi lingered a beat too long near Marcus's study door when he was on the phone. She asked, once, with studied casualness, whether the Riverside project had always belonged to the Whitfield family or whether Marcus had acquired it somewhere along the way. Isabel answered without thinking much of it, said something vague about Marcus building most of his early portfolio through acquisitions, and then caught the look that crossed Naomi's face for half a second before it disappeared behind the same calm expression she wore for everyone in that house. Isabel had spent 6 years learning to read Marcus. She was only beginning to realize she had spent almost as long failing to truly see the woman who cleaned his floors. Marcus's paranoia, meanwhile, had started curdling into something uglier than mere stress. He began questioning household staff about small missing items, a cufflink here, a pin there, objects that had likely simply been misplaced in a house with 30 rooms, and a rotating cast of contractors and caterers moving through it for various events. He fixated on these losses with an intensity that had little to do with their actual value. Naomi understood, watching him corner a young server over a missing letter opener, that Marcus needed to feel in control of something while the ground shifted beneath the one thing he could not control at all, the slow, grinding progress of an audit trail closing in on a truth he had buried for over 2 decades. He started looking at his own staff the way a man looks at people he suspects might already know more about him than they should. It was Simone who unintentionally escalated things 3 weeks before the gala, during what should have been an unremarkable dinner conversation. She mentioned, lightly, that she'd run into an old family friend who asked whatever happened to that construction company Marcus used to talk about in his early speeches. The one with the founder's name Simone could never quite remember. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He recovered quickly, made a joke about ancient history, but Naomi, clearing plates from the sideboard at that exact moment, saw something pass behind his eyes that she recognized instantly. Fear disguised as irritation. She had seen that same expression on her own father's face once, in reverse, standing in a courthouse hallway holding a piece of paper that had just taken everything from him. Now it belonged to the man who had taken it. 2 weeks before the anniversary gala, Marcus finally received the preliminary results of the internal audit he had been dreading. The analysts flagged inconsistencies were not, as he had hoped, simple clerical errors from 3 decades ago. They pointed, with increasing clarity, toward a documented history in which the original ownership transfer of what became Riverside Commons involved contract language that a court, viewed today with modern scrutiny, might well interpret very differently than a rush judge had interpreted it 26 years earlier. It would not undo anything automatically. It would not hand the property back to anyone. But it would, if it ever became public, attach a very different word to Marcus Whitfield's origin story than the one he had spent his career rehearsing in front of mirrors and journalists. The word was theft. And somewhere in that enormous house, a woman who had waited 11 years for exactly this moment continued dusting his mantle as though she knew nothing at all. The gala itself had been planned for nearly a year, an anniversary celebration marking 15 years of Marcus and Simone's marriage, though by that point the marriage itself had long since become more performance than partnership. Simone had thrown herself into the planning with an intensity that surprised even the household staff, choosing flowers, rehearsing toasts, commissioning an ice sculpture shaped like the Whitfield estate itself. Naomi watched her employer's wife pour herself into every detail of an event meant to celebrate a union that seemed, from the outside of that marble kitchen, increasingly hollow. She wondered sometimes whether Simone clung so tightly to the appearance of happiness because acknowledging otherwise would mean admitting how much of her own life she had quietly folded away to accommodate a man who required constant, uncomplicated admiration. Naomi understood that particular kind of folding better than anyone at that party would have guessed. Preparations for the gala brought nearly 3 times the usual staff into the house, caterers and florists, and a small orchestra rehearsing in the ballroom for 2 full days beforehand. Naomi found herself assigned to oversee several of the temporary staff, a responsibility that came with a small pay bonus she badly needed, since Denise's nursing program tuition had increased again that semester in a way neither of them had budgeted for. She moved through those final days with the same steady competence she brought to everything, checking place settings, coordinating with the catering company, making sure $500,000 worth of flowers arrived without a single wilted petal. Nobody watching her that week would have guessed she was carrying, quietly and without complaint, a truth large enough to unravel the entire event they were building toward. Marcus, in those final days before the party, grew increasingly erratic in ways that rippled through the household like static electricity. He fired a longtime gardener over a minor pruning disagreement, then rehired him 2 days later with an apology that fooled no one into thinking he had actually changed. He drank earlier in the day than usual, started conversations with his accountant that ended abruptly whenever staff entered the room, and snapped at Isabel twice in one afternoon over scheduling errors that, on any other week, would have barely registered as errors at all. Isabel began to suspect that the audit trouble ran deeper than Marcus had let on, though she still had no idea how deep, and certainly no idea that the woman polishing silver 2 rooms away held pieces of that same puzzle he was so desperately trying to keep buried. The night of the gala arrived unusually warm for the season, guests arriving in a steady stream of luxury vehicles that lined the circular driveway for nearly an hour before the event officially began. Naomi arrived early with the rest of the staff, dressed in the plain black uniform the catering company required, moving through final preparations with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent 11 years perfecting invisibility in rooms exactly like this one. She had no plan that evening to say anything at all. She fully intended, as she had every day for 6 months, to simply do her job, refill the water pitchers, clear the plates, and go home to her daughter with her secret still folded carefully in its usual place. Marcus Whitfield, drunk on champagne and unearned confidence, was about to make that intention impossible to keep. The first 2 hours of the gala unfolded exactly as Simone had planned them. A string quartet playing softly as guests arrived, waiters circulating with champagne, Marcus greeting business partners and old family friends with the practiced warmth of a man who had given hundreds of speeches about his own success. He moved through the ballroom shaking hands, accepting congratulations on 15 years of marriage, occasionally glancing towards Simone with an expression that might have passed for affection to anyone who hadn't watched the marriage hollow out slowly over more than a decade. Naomi worked the perimeter of the room with the other catering staff, refilling glasses, clearing appetizer plates, moving through the crowd the way she had learned to move through every room in that house, present enough to be useful and invisible enough to never be noticed. By the time the formal toasts began, Marcus had already had considerably more champagne than the evening called for. He stood at the head table, glass raised, delivering a speech about resilience and vision that Naomi had heard rehearsed behind his study door weeks earlier, word for word, including the line about building an empire from nothing but grit and instinct. She had heard that particular lie so many times by now that it no longer even stirred much anger in her, only a tired, familiar ache, the same ache she imagined her father must have carried every time he saw Marcus's name attached to buildings that should have carried his own. The guests applauded warmly. Simone smiled from beside him, her expression practiced and slightly distant. The smile of a woman who had learned to perform happiness convincingly enough that most people stopped looking closely enough to notice the difference. It was during the lull after the toasts, while the orchestra shifted into something lighter and guests drifted toward the dessert tables, that Marcus's mood curdled without warning. He had spent the earlier part of the evening successfully avoiding thoughts of the audit, the accountant's warnings, the quiet dread that had been building in him for weeks. But alcohol has a way of loosening exactly the anxieties a person spends the most energy suppressing. He noticed Naomi near the dessert table, refilling a water pitcher for a table she hadn't technically been assigned to, and something in him, some combination of unease and cruelty and the particular arrogance of a man who has never once faced real consequences, decided this was the moment to perform confidence for a room full of people whose approval he still, after everything, desperately needed. He turned to a cluster of nearby guests and asked, loudly enough for a dozen tables to hear, whether the entertainment staff were permitted to sample the desserts before the guests got to them, gesturing toward Naomi with the particular carelessness of a man who had never once had to learn anyone's actual job title in his own house. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the closest tables, the kind of laughter people offer a powerful man out of reflex rather than genuine amusement. Naomi set the pitcher down slowly, deliberately, the way she always handled things when her hands wanted to shake and she refused to let them. She had absorbed smaller cruelties from Marcus Whitfield for 11 years without ever once raising her voice. She had no way of knowing yet that this particular evening, this particular cruelty, was about to be the last one she would ever choose to swallow in silence. Marcus, emboldened by the laughter and the champagne and whatever deeper anxiety was still gnawing at him from the audit he couldn't stop thinking about, decided the joke deserved an encore. He stepped closer to Naomi, swaying slightly, his voice carrying now across an even wider stretch of the ballroom as conversations nearby began quieting to listen. He told the gathering crowd that he'd noticed money missing from his study desk the previous week, a detail he had never actually mentioned to Naomi or any staff member before that exact moment, and wondered aloud, with theatrical mock seriousness, whether the household help had decided to help themselves to more than just the desserts. The laughter this time was thinner, more uncertain, several guests glancing at each other with the particular discomfort of people realizing a joke had curdled into something they no longer wanted to be part of. 50 conversations stopped at once. Glasses lowered halfway to lips and stayed there. Simone, standing near the head table, felt her stomach drop as she watched her husband's face, recognizing the specific, reckless energy he got whenever he needed an audience more than he needed dignity. Isabel, stationed near the entrance to keep track of arriving latecomers, turned sharply at the sudden hush, understanding immediately from years of experience exactly what kind of moment this had become. Naomi felt the weight of every eye in that ballroom land on her simultaneously, the particular, suffocating pressure of being accused publicly by a man who had employed her for over a decade and still, after all that time, could not have told anyone in that room her last name if his life depended on it. She had two choices in that instant, the same two choices that had shaped nearly every difficult moment of her adult life. She could lower her eyes, apologize for a theft she had not committed, and let the moment pass the way she had let 1,000 smaller moments pass before it, absorbing the humiliation quietly because quiet had always kept her employed, kept Denise in school, kept the lights on in an apartment neither of them could afford to lose. Or she could speak. For 11 years, silence had been the practical choice, the safer choice, the choice that protected everything she had left. But something had shifted in Naomi over the past 6 months that none of these 50 guests understood, something that had nothing to do with a missing letter opener or petty cash from a desk drawer, and everything to do with a truth about Riverside Commons that she had carried quietly for far longer than Marcus had spent building his empire on top of it. Naomi lifted her chin slowly, deliberately, the same way she had learned to lift it from a father who had once stood in a courthouse hallway and refused to let a dismissal notice break him completely, even as it took nearly everything else. The ballroom, still holding its collective breath, watched a woman who had spent 11 years being professionally invisible decide, in that exact moment, that invisibility had finally cost her enough. Her lips parted. Marcus, still riding the high of his own performance, had no idea that the woman he'd just accused of theft in front of 50 of his closest business associates was about to speak 5 words that would strip away everything he had spent 26 years building on a foundation that had never truly belonged to him. "You stole this from my father." The words landed in that ballroom like a held breath finally released, quiet enough that guests 2 tables back had to lean toward their neighbors to confirm what they'd just heard, and loud enough, in the sudden silence, that everyone within 20 feet heard it perfectly the first time. Marcus's smile did not fall all at once. It faltered first, the corners twitching in confusion, the particular expression of a man whose brain has not yet caught up to what his body already understands has just happened. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not need to. 11 years of practiced calm carried those 5 words further than shouting ever could have, and something in her tone, steady and unhurried, told every person listening that this was not an accusation born of anger in the moment. This was a fact she had been holding, whole and unshaken, for a very long time. Simone's glass slipped slightly in her hand before she caught it. Isabel, still near the entrance, felt her stomach turn over as pieces she hadn't known were connected suddenly arranged themselves into a shape she should have recognized months earlier. Marcus opened his mouth, some reflexive denial already forming, the same practiced ease that had carried him through board meetings and press interviews for 2 decades. But nothing came out. His eyes moved over Naomi's face for the first time in 11 years, really moved over it, searching for something familiar, and whatever he found there stole the words directly out of his throat. A few guests began murmuring questions to each other. Someone near the head table asked aloud who her father was. Nobody moved to fill the silence Marcus had left hanging. Naomi did not wait for him to recover. She said her father's name clearly, the way she had wanted to say it in that house for 11 years and never once allowed herself to, watching it register on Marcus's face like a blow landing seconds after the punch. "Elijah Bishop," she told the room, in a voice that grew steadier with each sentence rather than shakier, that Riverside Commons had once belonged to Bishop Construction, that her father had built it with his own hands and his own crews, and that the man standing in front of them accepting congratulations for 15 years of marriage and decades of self-made success had taken it from him through a contract clause buried on page 11 that nobody had been meant to notice until it was already too late to matter. Marcus finally found his voice, thin and defensive, insisting this was ancient history, a business dispute settled decades ago through proper legal channels, his composure cracking at the edges even as he tried to reassert it. But Naomi was not finished, and this time it was Isabel who spoke next, stepping forward from the entrance with a folder she had been quietly compiling for weeks without fully understanding why, confirming in front of 50 stunned witnesses that the internal audit Marcus had spent a month trying to bury showed exactly the irregularities Naomi had just described. The ballroom that had gone silent for Marcus's cruelty now stayed silent for an entirely different reason, watching two women neither of them had ever truly seen before dismantle, piece by piece, the only story Marcus Whitfield had ever told about himself. Marcus stood frozen at the head table for what felt, to everyone watching, like an unnaturally long stretch of silence, though in reality it lasted only a handful of seconds. His face moved through several expressions in quick succession, confusion giving way to anger, anger giving way to something closer to panic as he registered just how many witnesses now stood between him and any version of this evening he could still control. He turned toward Isabel first, demanding to know what folder she was holding and why she had brought it to his own anniversary party, his voice climbing toward the register he used when he wanted people to remember who paid their salary. Isabel did not flinch the way she once might have. 6 years of absorbing his temper had taught her exactly how much weight his anger actually carried once an audience stopped being impressed by it. She told him, calmly, that the folder contained the preliminary audit findings his own accounting firm had flagged 3 weeks earlier, the same findings he had spent that entire time trying to keep from reaching the board, and that she had brought it tonight not to embarrass him, but because something in Naomi's earlier questions about Riverside Commons had made her uneasy enough to start looking closer at records she'd previously never had reason to question. She had not known, until this exact moment, that the woman asking those questions was the daughter of the man whose name had been quietly erased from every document tracing that property's history. Isabel's voice cracked slightly on that last part, the realization of what she had unknowingly been sitting on for weeks finally landing with its full weight. Guests near the head table began pulling out phones, some recording discreetly, others simply staring, unable to look away from a moment none of them had walked into that ballroom expecting to witness. A business partner Marcus had known for 15 years asked, quietly but audibly, whether any of what Naomi said was actually true, and Marcus's hesitation before answering told the room more than any denial could have. Simone rose slowly from her seat beside him, her expression unreadable, and for the first time in longer than either of them could probably calculate, she looked directly at her husband rather than performing the practiced warmth she usually reserved for public moments. She did not defend him. She did not immediately condemn him either. She simply looked, the way a person looks at someone they are seeing clearly for the very first time after years of choosing not to. Naomi, still standing near the dessert table where this had all begun, felt something unclench in her chest that had been tight for 11 years. Longer than that, really. Tight since a courthouse hallway decades earlier, when she had watched her father hold a piece of paper that took everything from him. She had not planned this moment. She had not walked into that ballroom that evening intending to say a single word about Riverside Commons, or her father's name, or any of it. But watching Marcus Whitfield stand exposed in front of the very people whose admiration he had built his entire identity around, she understood that some truths simply choose their own moment to surface, regardless of how carefully a person has tried to keep them buried. And regardless of how long they have waited quietly for justice that finally seemed within reach. Simone Whitfield's silence stretched long enough that several nearby guests began to shift uncomfortably, unsure whether the evening's entertainment had somehow become this instead, a marriage and an empire unraveling in real time under crystal chandeliers, meant to celebrate neither of those things ending. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the practiced warmth she'd used all evening greeting guests. She asked Marcus, simply, whether it was true, whether the company he had spent 15 years of their marriage describing as something he built entirely alone had actually belonged to someone else first, someone whose daughter had been quietly cleaning their home for over a decade while he told that same lie to reporters, investors, and eventually to their own 2 children who idolized him. Marcus's answer, when it finally came, was not the outright denial the room seemed to expect. Something in him, some last fragment of the man he might have been before decades of unearned success calcified into arrogance, seemed to buckle under the accumulated weight of every eye still fixed on him. He said the deal with Elijah Bishop had been legal, that courts had reviewed it decades earlier and found nothing improper, that he had built plenty on his own even if the initial foundation had come from somewhere else. It was, in its own way, the closest thing to an admission he had ever made in public, and the ballroom seemed to register it as exactly that, a confession dressed up in legal language. The same trick he had used 26 years earlier to take a company from a man who trusted him. Naomi listened to him minimize what he'd done, watched him reach for the word legal the way a drowning man reaches for anything solid, and felt no satisfaction in watching him squirm, only a tired, hollow confirmation of something she had always known about him. Men like Marcus rarely felt shame over what they'd done. They felt shame only over being caught doing it in a room full of people whose opinions still mattered to them. She stepped forward, past the dessert table, closer to the head table than she had ever stood in 11 years of employment there, and told him, clearly enough for everyone still watching to hear, that legal and right had never once meant the same thing, and that her father had spent the rest of his life carrying a burden Marcus had never once had to acknowledge, let alone repay. A murmur moved through the crowd, and this time it did not sound uncertain the way it had earlier. Several guests, business associates, and old friends who had known Marcus for decades, exchanged glances that suggested private doubts long suppressed were finally finding permission to surface. One older gentleman near the back, a man who had known Elijah Bishop personally through the construction trade decades earlier, stood slowly and confirmed, in a voice thick with old grief, that he remembered the man, remembered his integrity, remembered how quietly he had disappeared from the industry after everything fell apart. It was, for Naomi, the first time in 11 years that anyone in that world had spoken her father's name with the respect it had always deserved, and hearing it now, in this room, felt like something long overdue finally settling into place. The gentleman who stood, an older developer named Harold Fitzgerald who had crossed paths with Elijah Bishop on job sites decades before Marcus ever entered the picture, did not sit back down once he'd spoken. He remained standing, addressing the room now rather than simply Marcus, recounting details Naomi herself had never fully known, memories of her father's early reputation for fair dealing, for paying subcontractors on time when other developers routinely stretched payments out for months. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had always privately wondered what happened to Bishop Construction after it disappeared so abruptly from the regional market, and that he had simply assumed, the way people assume when they don't want to look too closely at uncomfortable truths, that Elijah had retired or sold the business on his own terms. Hearing the actual story now, watching Marcus's face as it unfolded, Harold said quietly that he felt ashamed of never having asked. That admission seemed to open something in the room that Marcus could not close back up no matter how hard he tried. Another guest, a woman who had served on a zoning board decades earlier, mentioned that she remembered reviewing paperwork for Riverside Commons around the time of its original transfer, and that something about the timeline had always struck her as unusually fast for a project that size, though she'd never had reason to question it publicly. Each new voice added another small piece to a picture that had been scattered across dozens of memories for over 2 decades, fragments nobody had ever assembled because nobody had ever had a reason to look for the whole shape until this exact moment. In this exact room, with Naomi standing at its center refusing to disappear back into the wallpaper the way she had for 11 years. Marcus attempted, weakly, to redirect the conversation toward the party itself, gesturing toward the orchestra, suggesting they continue the celebration and address any misunderstandings privately at a more appropriate time. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for their champagne. The orchestra, sensing the room's mood without needing to be told anything explicitly, had already stopped playing several minutes earlier, and now sat quietly with their instruments lowered, watching the same scene as everyone else. Simone, still standing beside her husband, but no longer beside him in any sense that mattered, told him flatly that there would be no continuing the celebration, that 15 years of marriage did not obligate her to keep protecting a lie she had just learned was built on someone else's stolen life's work. Naomi felt Denise's absence acutely in that moment, wishing briefly that her daughter could see this, could see the man who had underpaid and overlooked her mother for over a decade finally standing exposed in front of everyone whose respect he had spent his entire life chasing. But she also understood, watching Isabel move quietly toward Simone's side and away from Marcus's, watching Harold Fitzgerald sit back down with the weight of old memory still visible on his face, that this moment had never really been about revenge, no matter how satisfying it felt to watch it unfold. It had always simply been about the truth finally standing in a room it had been kept out of for 26 years, and refusing, at last, to leave quietly. The days following the gala moved quickly in ways Naomi could never have anticipated, the story spreading first through whispered phone calls among the guests who had witnessed it, then through screenshots of the recordings several attendees had quietly captured on their phones, footage that found its way online within 48 hours and accumulated views at a pace nobody in that ballroom could have predicted. Business journalists who had spent years profiling Marcus as a self-made visionary began making calls, asking questions they had apparently never thought to ask before, tracking down old records related to Riverside Commons, and, eventually, tracking down Naomi herself, though she initially declined every request for an interview, uncertain what to make of sudden attention after 11 years of practiced invisibility. Isabel's decision to bring that audit folder to the gala, one she later admitted she had made almost impulsively, without fully planning what she intended to do with it, triggered a formal internal investigation within Marcus's own company that moved far faster than the original lawsuit ever had decades earlier. Modern financial regulations, along with modern scrutiny toward exactly the kind of ownership transfer clause buried in that old contract, meant investigators found the same red flags Elijah's overworked lawyer had missed 26 years earlier, except this time nobody had reason to look away. Marcus's board, many of whom had grown weary of his temperament and erratic decisions long before that evening, used the scandal as justification to remove him from operational control of his own company within 3 weeks, a fall from power that happened with a speed that mirrored, almost precisely, how quickly he had once taken everything from her father. Naomi found herself, in the weeks that followed, sitting across from lawyers for the first time in her adult life, not the overworked kind her father had once relied on, but attorneys who specialized in exactly this type of historical property dispute and who took her case pro bono once the story gained enough public attention to matter to their own reputations. They explained, carefully, that a full legal reclaim of Riverside Commons after 26 years remained unlikely given how many times the property had changed hands within Marcus's larger holdings since the original transfer. but a substantial settlement, they said, acknowledging the fraudulent nature of the original contract and compensating her family for decades of lost value, was very much within reach, particularly with Harold Fitzgerald and several other witnesses now willing to testify to what they remembered about Elijah Bishop's original ownership. Denise, when she finally heard the full story from her mother rather than from the increasingly distorted versions circulating online, sat in stunned silence for a long stretch before asking why Naomi had never told her any of it, why she had carried her grandfather's story alone for so many years without once mentioning it to the daughter who had grown up believing her mother simply cleaned houses for a living because that was the only work available to her. Naomi told her the truth, that some burdens feel lighter when carried alone, that she had spent so long protecting Denise from the same helplessness that had hollowed out her own father that she had forgotten protection sometimes looks like silence when it should have looked like trust. It was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of a different kind of honesty between them, one neither of them had realized they were missing until it finally arrived. The settlement, when it finally came through nearly 8 months after the gala, amounted to a sum large enough to change the practical shape of Naomi's life without erasing, in any real sense, what the past 26 years had already cost her family. She used part of it to pay off the remainder of Denise's nursing tuition outright, watching her daughter graduate that spring without the weight of student debt neither of them had ever quite stopped worrying about. She used another portion to finally move out of the apartment she and Denise had shared since James died, into a modest house of her own with a small garden in the back, the kind of quiet, permanent stability her father had once tried to build for his own family before it was taken from him. She did not buy anything extravagant. She had spent too many years cleaning up after extravagance to want much of it for herself. Marcus's company, stripped of his operational control and burdened by a scandal that had permanently attached itself to his name, eventually rebranded entirely under new leadership, quietly removing his name from buildings and letterhead across the region in a slow, methodical erasure that mirrored, with a kind of poetic symmetry Naomi noticed, but never commented on publicly, the exact erasure her own father had once suffered decades earlier. Marcus retreated from public life almost entirely after that, no longer invited to the galas and boardrooms that had once defined his existence. His fortune diminished, but not destroyed. His reputation, the thing he had clearly valued more than anything else, permanently and irreversibly altered. Naomi felt no particular joy in his downfall when she heard about it secondhand. She felt only the quiet satisfaction of a scale finally, however imperfectly, finding something closer to balance after 26 years of sitting badly tilted. Simone reached out to Naomi once, several months after the gala, an unexpected phone call that Naomi almost didn't answer given the unfamiliar number. Simone apologized, haltingly, for years of quiet complicity, for choosing comfort over honesty long before she ever understood the full scope of what that comfort had cost other people. She had filed for divorce within weeks of the gala and was, she said, trying to rebuild something resembling an honest life for the first time in 14 years of marriage. Naomi accepted the apology without pretending it repaired anything significant between them, understanding that some conversations exist simply to be had rather than to fix what came before them. The two women did not become friends, but something had shifted between them that neither fully needed to name aloud. Naomi returned, eventually, to the town where she had grown up, standing for the first time in over 3 decades in front of the original Bishop construction sign, long since painted over, but still faintly visible beneath newer layers if a person knew exactly where to look. She stood there for a long while, thinking about her father's hands, steady once, framing entire houses without needing a level, shaking later in ways nobody had ever properly acknowledged or repaid. She did not need Marcus Whitfield's ruin to feel whole. She had needed, simply, for for the truth to finally stand somewhere in daylight after 26 years buried beneath marble floors and rehearsed speeches, and now, finally, quietly, it did.